Next presentation is from Megan Schmidt. Megan is the training manager for adult protective services at the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. She brings 18 years of experience in human services field, focusing on inpatient behavioral health and crisis management. So I will go ahead and turn the time over to you, Megan.
I'm very happy to be joining the Elder Justice Conference today, sharing ways that we can connect, advocate, and empower and protect our older adults across the state of Utah. So today we're going to spend some time together just learning about abuse, neglect, and exploitation of older adults. So just reviewing our learning objectives and kind of what we hope to accomplish during our time together, we're going to define abuse, neglect, and exploitation of older adults or vulnerable populations, identify those warning signs of potential abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We will identify ways to engage, advocate, and empower, and then also describe the steps to take if abuse or neglect is suspected. So this is a quote that has resonated with me for a long time, and so I thought it would be a good one for us to share. So the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. And it's never been more important for our communities to pull together and ensure that our neighbors and vulnerable populations are receiving the care and the support that they need and that they want as they age. So looking at some nationwide demographic shifts. So this information comes from the Aging in the US fact sheet that was released in January of 2024. So we are an aging nation, and the number of Americans age 65 and older is projected to increase by 47% in the next 25 years, which feels pretty staggering. And older adults are staying in the workforce longer, and more older adults are meeting their kind of daily needs on their own, which allows them to kind of support in the idea and the goal of aging in their desired environment. And it's interesting to see these shifts as our population is shifting into what we are now kind of referring as an aging nation. And just knowing that even with these shifts that we'll see kind of in caregiving gaps and what the needs are, our aging nation is more confident in their abilities to remain in the workforce or be able to serve their own care needs or how to advocate for themselves out in the community. So for the first time in US history, older adults are projected to outnumber children by 2034. This stat and kind of this idea, when it first started coming out several years ago, it was by 2040, and then it shifted to 2037. And it's just kind of been rolling back a little bit more each year as we've progressed. So why is this important? So there's a number of reasons. The 2030s are projected to be a very transformative decade for the US population. The population is expected to grow at a slower pace, which has never happened before, which will impact our caregiver availability, which will also lead to a caregiver gap. So we will see this need as our population ages. Will we be able to match the level of care and the level of desired care for our aging population? And we will, as we're becoming an aging nation, we're going to age considerably during that time. So this kind of leads us into the concept and why we're here during this time together of what is older adult abuse. So it's defined as an intentional or a knowing act or failure to act by a caregiver or another person that places harm or causes harm or serious risk to a vulnerable adult. And we'll define kind of in a couple slides of that term vulnerable adult and what it means in the state of Utah. But it's estimated that 1 in 10 Americans age 60 plus have experienced some form of older adult abuse. And this statistic does not kind of give us a complete picture, as abuse of older adults is vastly underreported. So I've seen anywhere that number could be 1 in 10. It could be as high in some communities as 4 or 5 in 10. So it's becoming very, very prevalent for our aging population. And that idea and that reporting of older adult abuse leads us to who is Adult Protective Services. So we are the state agency in the state of Utah with the responsibility and authority to investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation involving vulnerable adults. So let's take some time to define who is a vulnerable adult. I will say this is specific just to the state of Utah. Each state defines vulnerability in a different way. And so it's good just to know what that looks like for each state or where you reside. So in Utah, we have 2 categories. So an older adult is defined as someone that's age 65 or older. And then we have a dependent adult. So that's somebody that is 18 or older who has a mental or a physical impairment that substantially affects that person's ability. We do not have a diagnosis, a condition, or disorder that automatically makes somebody vulnerable. We look at those as a case-by-case basis and as each individual person. And so on this next slide, we'll kind of define those factors where we determine vulnerability. And so of these 6 factors that are there, only one of these factors needs to be substantially affected to determine vulnerability for somebody that's age 18 to 64. We will see some individuals where reports will come into our agency at Adult Protective Services where they will meet all 6 of those. Some individuals may be struggling with managing their own financial resources. There could be individuals that are having difficulty accessing healthcare needs or those services that allow them to remain in the community. And as this is the Elder Justice Conference, we will focus on that older adult category for the remainder of the time that we are together. But it's good information just to know because we have community members, families, older adults, elder justice professionals, a lot of different individuals that are joining us today. So these are the types of older adult abuse that we will look at and focus on today. So Adult Protective Services in Utah investigates multiple types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Today, we'll talk about physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, both caretaker and self-neglect, and then financial exploitation. And we'll take some time right now to define what those types are, and then we will go into kind of those warning signs after that once we have a good idea of what those different forms look like. So the physical abuse. This is generally what we think of being like a physical assault. So, or an injury that's happening to an older adult. So this could be hitting, kicking, punching, biting, slapping, shoving, any of those actions that could result in an injury to another person or cause them harm. And this is done knowingly or intentionally with the attempt to cause harm, place somebody in the fear of harm, or attempting to cause harm to them. And so we will look at all of the different aspects that could go into this situation, and then also knowing kind of the factors that could lead to this. And that's something that we will focus on in a little bit, and it also contributes to the other information that's being shared through the rest of the conference today. So then looking at emotional abuse. And this is that knowing or intentional verbal or nonverbal conduct that could be directed at an older adult, which could include intimidation, threats, threatening attitudes or behaviors that are going towards a vulnerable adult, isolation, that person feeling like they are being coerced or harassed. And if this conduct results in emotional distress, fear, humiliation, agitation of that older adult, this is what we consider and what we look at as emotional abuse. These emotional abuse situations are very challenging. It's challenging for that older adult to be part of that situation. It's also very challenging for our caregivers and families and loved ones and providers to bear witness to these situations that are happening. And so this is where we are wanting to make sure that we can help with that advocacy and empowering for those older adults or those vulnerable adults to try to reduce the risk of this happening again for them in the future, knowing that the emotional abuse piece can be so pervasive. And then looking at caretaker neglect. So this is failure by a caretaker to provide the necessary level of care for an older adult. Each person receiving care has a different level of care needs. So this could include nutritional needs, hygiene, medication management, scheduling or maintaining appointments. This could be medical, dental, behavioral health appointments, as well as kind of maintaining the safety in the home. So it also includes that intentional failure by a caretaker to carry out a prescribed treatment plan. This is something that we will oftentimes get asked of what this looks like. And an example could be somebody's dietary needs. So if they are requiring a dietary restriction or a special diet that is ordered by a care provider, this could also be that medication administration in terms of the times that a medication would need to be administered to an individual, or it could also be access to ongoing appointments for the health and kind of well-being of that person receiving care. We have seen situations where it's either limiting somebody's access to physical therapy appointments that could help promote their independence. That could be something that we could look at. And then looking at self-neglect. We are seeing more and more situations to where we would be concerned in the community for older adults or vulnerable populations as it relates to self-neglect. So this is failure by a vulnerable adult to maintain the necessary level of care for themselves. So this could include access to food, clean water, hygiene cares, shelter needs, including maintaining their utilities, safety, and other services that are necessary to maintain their well-being. And this failure is a result of a mental or physical impairment of that adult. What this can oftentimes look like in the community is, we'll just use an example of an older adult that's been living in their home for a number of years. The home has generally been well kept. Their personal cares have generally always been met. When you've gone over to meet with them, see them, they are usually groomed and they're wearing clean clothes. But over the recent months that you've been going to visit them or interacting with them, you've noticed some changes. So those changes could be that they're no longer able to maintain the cleanliness of their home, or you're noticing trash or items that are piling up in the home and they're no longer able to move them out, or you're seeing them out in the community and they're wearing the same clothing each time that you're seeing them, and maybe each time it is more soiled, or the clothes appear more dirty each time that person is out in the community. Those are oftentimes the things that family members, medical providers, communities are noticing as it relates to those concerns for self-neglect. And then looking at financial exploitation. So this is the illegal or improper use of an older adult's funds, property, credits, or assets. It is unfortunately our most common form of older adult abuse, but only a fraction of those exploitation cases are reported. So those that are most at increased risk for exploitation as they age are individuals with a cognitive impairment or a cognitive decline, physical limitations, or recent loss of a partner or a loved one. So Emily really touched just on this previous presentation on kind of all of those areas that could exponentially raise somebody's rates of and risk of being exploited. And we do see that, especially for individuals that have recently lost a partner or a loved one, grief makes us do things that we would not normally do in other situations. And so we have a tendency to divert activities, we will trust more, we will engage in behavior that is not generally something that's observed in our family during those periods of grief. And so those are the situations where family members, other people in the community could especially take advantage of that person during that time. And so now let's look at kind of those warning signs of older adult abuse. So we will go through and we will look at each of those areas that we just defined. Our hope is to gain an understanding of these signs and know that it is not an all-inclusive list. But these are the signs that are oftentimes recognized by families, caregivers, providers, and older adults themselves. So as it relates to physical abuse, one of the most common sign or warning signs that we see is an injury that is inconsistent with an explanation for its cause. And so this could be an example of somebody that has reported to fall recently, either in their home or if they're living in kind of a higher level of care. And it's reported that they fell on their left side of the body where there's injuries or maybe bruising that's noted on that side, but there's also bruising on that person's back or on their chest. So areas that are not consistent with that reason for why that injury is being reported. Additionally, we're seeing individuals with cuts, bruises, welts, or other forms of injuries to an older adult. And when the caregiver or the person involved has a dismissive attitude or is minimizing what is being reported by that older adult, that can be a pretty big red flag that you can watch out for. Also, as it relates to inappropriate medication administration, physical restraint of that individual, or forcing somebody to be isolated in a situation, especially as it relates to disclosing what's happening or reporting or taking kind of that social connection and wanting to reach out to somebody else, if that is being reduced or kind of halted, those are all red flags to watch out for around an injury. Then looking at the emotional abuse signs. So again, it's a very challenging factor for us to look at, just knowing that behavioral considerations can change for individuals, relationship dynamics can change. That's one of the big things that we do also consider as well. So the signs that we're looking for, though, is when an older adult who is in fear, withdrawing from others, or appearing agitated when interacting with somebody. And the big piece with that is, especially when that agitation is uncharacteristic and a change from their normal behavior. So we do see changes in behavior that can come from a family or caregiver side or from the older adult themselves. So it's kind of those immediate changes or uncharacteristic changes, especially as it relates to a relationship with a caregiver, a family member, somebody in the community. Those are things that we will see. An example or something that you can kind of keep an eye out for or may kind of strike a conversation is if you hear somebody yelling at or demeaning an older adult, and once they realize that others are present or that there's other people in the room and their tone greatly changes or their body language, their behavior changes, that can be a red flag to pay attention to and know that that could be a warning sign that there's something that's going on as it relates to emotional abuse. And then looking at caretaker neglect. So those warning signs oftentimes will include an older adult who lacks basic hygiene cares, they appear malnourished or dehydrated, or they lack access to medical aids, so such as a walker, glasses, hearing aids. And this is a big component for me because it also looks at the idea that if they had access to those medical needs or those medical aids, could it increase their dependence as an older adult? Or could it increase their ability to do things without the aid of that caregiver? And so in the community, it can oftentimes be observed as somebody that's just going without the things that they need, or a older adult reporting that there's things that they need that they're not having access to. And then looking at the warning signs for self-neglect. This has become a large topic of conversation in meetings that are happening throughout, in contacts with medical providers, law enforcement. Just because we are an aging nation, we are seeing individuals that are residing in their homes for longer periods of time and wanting to ensure that we can help those individuals age in place. But there's oftentimes those concerns that are being presented by family members and different individuals. So this could be somebody, or kind of concerns that somebody might be neglecting themselves if their utilities are shut off or at risk of shut off. And so that could be individuals that are either due to inability to pay, or they may no longer observe or feel the need to have those utilities on, or the concern that they do not realize that the utility has been shut off, or they're trying to continue to use the home even without the use of electricity or without running water. We have seen situations in the winter times where maybe their heating source has been turned off, and so they will use space heaters or other things like that, or multiple blankets in an effort to keep themselves warm in the colder months, or spending time outside of their residence and trying to be in areas where they have access to air conditioning in those summer months. Other things that are being observed or warning signs where the residence is extremely dirty, filled with garbage, animal feces. That's usually speaking to the concern that that person may not have the ability to remove the trash from their home or pick up after that pet anymore. And they oftentimes, it could be due to that social isolation piece, or not having access to individuals that they trust, or that person that you feel like you could ask that favor. So somebody kind of in that inner circle where you could ask for help. And so they have a tendency for those things to just continue to pile up or build up in their home. The other things that we are looking for that we'll see is if they don't have access to fresh food, or items in the home are expired or only spoiled, and then showing up for appointments in like soiled or dirty clothing. And then those warning signs of financial exploitation. And so this could be anything from missing personal possessions, unexplained withdrawal of funds. One that touches and kind of resonates with me a lot is kind of that idea of a power of attorney or other financial or medical decision-making documents, those being changed after the person has ceased to have the ability to kind of make those decisions. And we have seen an increase or concerned risk for that of individuals that are kind of potentially preying on somebody's vulnerability with an effort to gain access to funds or to gain access to property, and taking that advantage of that. And also knowing if there's been changes recently in somebody's deed to their home, titles on property, titles on ownership of a boat, a car, any of those kind of other items as well. And then also, one of the things that I have been doing trainings recently and that has come up of resonating with individuals is that unusual interest in a person's assets, or kind of unusual interest in learning more about those things. And so that can be a red flag kind of as we're looking at those concerns. So this next concept is the sandwich generation. This might be a new idea or a new word, but I'm sure that the concept resonates with a lot of individuals that are joining us today. So factors that can lead to increased risk of abuse, neglect, and exploitation is the impact and strain of caregiving on family, on friends, on even our paid caregivers. So the sandwich generation is called that because they are sandwiched between two generations needing their support and care at the same time. So aging parents or aging family members, and then children. And so the high physical and emotional and mental costs that can come with caregiving brings us to a concept that is drawing more attention, so much so that caregiver burnout is the topic of the next presentation. I have had a number of people reach out to me recently after learning about the sandwich generation and hearing that term and saying, that's me, but I had no idea that there was a term for it. I didn't know that this was something that a lot of people were facing. I just thought this was what I would have to deal with my aging parents, or kind of that idea of being thrust into that role as a caregiver when it's unexpected or not something that you were planning on. And so it can be helpful just to know what the term is of that generation of individuals, and then knowing and leading into what resources could be available to help make that caregiving process as beneficial for the caregiver and then also the person that's receiving care. So now we'll look at kind of ways to engage, advocate, and empower older adults. So a question that is oftentimes asked is kind of how can we prevent older adult abuse, or how can we prevent vulnerable adult abuse? We know that education is the cornerstone of preventing older adult abuse. It's also the cornerstone of preventing abuse across the lifespan. So these tips, when reviewed by medical professionals, discussed in families, can really help promote self-advocacy and empowerment for older adults. Staying active in the community is one of my favorite tips. There is power in numbers. As our social circles grow, so does our self-confidence. I have heard conversations offering advice, encouraging friends to stand up for themselves and to just have a shoulder to lean on, all over lunch at the senior center. I've also seen situations where somebody that is regularly attending a support group, a class at the gym, or a activity at the senior center, if all of a sudden they're not there, one of the considerations is that the other people in that group are wondering where that person is. They want to know where their friend is, why they're not there. They want to make sure that they are staying as socially connected as possible. So that ability to stay active in the community is a huge protective factor as we age. And it's something that Emily is, and I think we all know now, we need to promote kind of throughout the lifespan, knowing that social communication and connection can be easier at certain times in our life, but it's never more relevant than as we age. So then these are other resources that are available throughout the state of Utah. So you can visit our website at dos.utah.gov/services, or you can search or can contact your local area agency on aging, or the AAA, which is a little bit easier. It's not quite so much of a mouthful. And you can be connected with service options, resource contacts, all with the click of a button. So I highly encourage everyone listening today to find their local area agency on aging, even if you do not need to utilize the services right now, even if it just comes from the knowledge is power kind of aspect and wanting to plan for the future or know what is out there and become familiar with what services are available for older adults. The Caregiver Support Program can offer education, connection, and sometimes respite to our unpaid caregivers. So we know through that sandwich generation, and as we go on to talk about caregiver burnout in the next presentation, being seen and supported as a caregiver is a protective factor that can reduce caregiver burnout and reduce the risk of abuse, neglect, and exploitation for our vulnerable populations. So Elder Care Locator is another great resource that you can visit. And so it's eldercare.acl.gov to learn about resources in your area. So I did a quick search just for Salt Lake City. And the first result that came up was Salt Lake County Aging Services, which had the phone number, the address, the website, and the services offered all available in one search. So all it took was me entering in Salt Lake City. And I also did a search just of our zip code. And both of them were able to bring up those services that are available. And it's nice because it is just a free resource and you can collect that information and have it and then use it when it's necessary. And also it can be helpful in kind of that future planning for aging parents, aging family members, just to know what could be out there, and helps you feel more confident if you are in that sandwich generation right now. So now let's look at kind of reporting older adult abuse in Utah and what that can look like. So Utah has a mandatory reporting law, which states that any person who has a reason to believe that any vulnerable adult has been the subject of abuse, neglect, or exploitation shall immediately notify Adult Protective Services intake or the nearest law enforcement agency. As we work in our chosen professions, as we are working, if you're working with in the elder justice field or helping with older adults or vulnerable populations, it can be easy to remember that you're a mandatory reporter when you're on the clock or when you're wearing your badge. But it's a good reminder for everybody that we are mandatory reporters throughout our life, as long as we reside in Utah. So it is something that you would want to do while you are working, but this is also geared towards your neighbors, your family members, individuals in your community. So we are mandated to report with any concerns that would come up as a Utah. And then how to report to our agency. So to report abuse, neglect, or exploitation of vulnerable adults, you can call our 1-800 number from Monday through Friday between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. to 1-800-371-7897, or you can report online 24/7 at DAAS, so daas.utah.gov. And this is what our Aging and Adult Services website looks like, so that daas.utah.gov. The green bar that's right in the center of the page is where you will click to make an online report of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The information and the questions that are asked are the same, whether you would be reporting online or if you would be calling in. It just gives you two options, mainly because we recognize that concerns or issues or areas where you feel like you would need to report, they don't always happen during those business hours. And so it's nice to know, especially for individuals that are working in the community, if something would happen in the evenings, the weekends, it just gives another option and way to report. And so what do you need to share with Adult Protective Services? Our hope is that you will share as much information as you are aware of. So this could include any information about the vulnerable adult, their age, their date of birth, how they're vulnerable. So either due by age or an impairment, their living situation. If there is an alleged perpetrator within the concern, then as much information as you can share about that person as well. So including if they reside with the vulnerable adult, that's extremely helpful for our agency to know. And then also looking at collateral information, this could be family, providers, neighbors, any individuals that may be aware of the situation or be able to provide information can be very helpful. And then your information as a referent, which is always kept confidential by our agency. And so I've seen a number of questions kind of in the Q&A and chat. So I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for that. But my hope for our time together today is that you gained knowledge and empowerment to help support our vulnerable populations in the community and kind of working towards that, the conference goal of today of prevention through connection. So thank you, and I will turn the time over to Linda for questions.
Thank you, Megan. Tons of really great information. I'm just curious off the top, I maybe mentioned this and I missed it somewhere. What is the most common form of abuse you're seeing with older adults in our communities?
Yes, so financial exploitation. It's our number one and our fastest growing in the state of Utah, but then also nationwide. Unfortunately, it's just, we are seeing it, and there's nobody that is immune to financial exploitation. So as we age, or with a cognitive impairment or a physical disability or just kind of that risk for loneliness or isolation, we are seeing increased risk and rates for those individuals on a daily basis.
Right. So just a reminder, if you have questions for Megan, to type those into the Q&A. Some of you may have joined later. Kind of along that line of financial exploitation, before we get to the questions, I just had a question about scams. So I understand that Adult Protective Services doesn't investigate scams. Is that correct?
That
Can
is
you
correct.
explain why?
Yes. So one of the biggest reasons why is because they're happening at such an alarming rate. And so our investigation team throughout the state, because they're happening at such a large rate, along with the factors that sometimes it is under a large organization or it is somebody that's maybe not even in the country that is the perpetrator of that. That's where we are going to those agencies that have the ability to investigate those especially at an organizational level. So there's like the National Elder Fraud Abuse Hotline, there's the Federal Trade Commission, there's organizations that are dedicated to scam prevention and kind of prosecution of those scams.
So along that line, just to let you know, because scams are so prevalent in our communities, we decided at our website, which is the utahelderjustice.org, we have a resource tab at the top that is dedicated to scam resources, where to report the different types of scams that are out there as well. So that's a resource for you there in the community. Okay, let me get to some of our questions here. Quite a few have come in. So let's see. Can reporting be done anonymously?
Yes, absolutely. You do have the ability to report anonymously. We do have individuals that will do that from time to time, either online or over the phone. It can be reported. So know that that is an option, but our agency, Adult Protective Services, we will protect your identity as the referent. And so that would not be released by our investigation. That would not be released through a records request. So that information as the referent is always kept confidential.
Right. So what advice do you have for helping someone who is self-neglecting, but they refuse help from family or friends?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's happening more and more, and it kind of ties directly. Sometimes I feel like a broken record when I say it, but that we are an aging nation. And we have individuals that are residing in their homes for longer periods of time, and they have a decision or they have a drive or an urge that they want to remain in that home for as long as possible, even if it may be moving towards the idea that they're no longer able to properly care for themselves. And so I think having that conversation with compassion and being open especially if you are coming from a family perspective, having that conversation with as much compassion as possible with that person that you have concerns for, knowing that there may be a very specific reason why they're refusing care or why they are saying that they don't want to. And so if they are maybe pushing back or saying, I'm not willing to leave or I'm not willing to bring services in, having that conversation of why, like what is their concern, what is their fear with not wanting to accept. For a lot of our older adults, it's because they don't know what's out there. They don't know that accepting care in the home could help them age in place. I think there's that fear that's out there that if Adult Protective Services is involved or if the county's involved, then it's going to mean they're going to have to leave their home or that there's going to be people that are going to try to remove them from their home. Whereas with our agency, Adult Protective Services, which we are kind of under the Division of Aging and Adult Services, our vision is offering choices for independence. So we want to help vulnerable and older adults age in place and age in the environment that they want to. And so whatever services, if it's working with MEG, Aging Services, or any of the other area agencies on aging to help that person age in place, then that's what we're going to try to do. Or if it's looking at talking to a medical professional, getting home health services in for a short period of time. But I think it's really being compassionate in the conversation, being willing to revisit that conversation often, and then also respecting the autonomy of that older adult if they do have the ability to make that decision and there's no concerns for like decision-making capacity or their ability to make that safe decision, just having that respect for that person's autonomy as they age as well.
You mentioned in your comment that one of the reasons people might refuse help is they don't understand the resources out there. And we've had a number of questions on self-neglect. One person wondering, is it pride? Is that why they're self-neglecting? Can you address some of the things that you've seen or heard that might
Mhm.
lead to somebody's self-neglect?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and pride can be a factor with self-neglect. Unfortunately, pride, embarrassment, shame is a compounding factor in all forms of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So we see that across the board with our investigations. But I think with self-neglect, especially, or the idea of moving into the possible need for a caretaker, it's that loss of independence, or it's that loss of ability to care for themselves at the level that they once were able to. There is a level of pride that's there. And for some of our older adults or individuals, it's that idea of, when do you know that you're no longer able to do those things for yourself? If you've just slowed down a little bit, or maybe it just takes you a little bit longer to get home because maybe you've taken a couple wrong turns on this most recent trip home. Is that enough for you to know that it's no longer? So I think that can be a challenging piece if you don't kind of want to kind of look at it, because there is that pride piece. It can be extremely challenging. And it's also hard for family members to start that conversation. Like, who wants to have that conversation with their aging parent of like, I noticed that you got lost several times driving home over the last week, or there's a huge scratch on your car. How did that happen? Or all of a sudden there's utility shut off notices at the home. It's a very challenging conversation to have. And one of the biggest things that we recommend is having that conversation with a aging parent very early on, having it early and often. And so having them make the decisions of how they want to age and what that looks like before they would even have to execute any of those plans, where it looks like advanced care planning or developing the necessary like financial documentation, so that they are in kind of the driver's seat of making the decisions as they age. And it helps those family members or people that may serve as a caregiver in the future know that, yep, they've already made all these decisions. Now I just need to help execute them as this person ages.
So you already touched on this, but I don't think you can say it enough. So I'll go ahead and ask the question again. If I report someone who is self-neglecting, will APS force them to move into a nursing home?
No, we will not. So that's not one thing that we would want. It doesn't fall within our powers of duties. So we will not remove somebody or place them in a facility against their will, unless there is a small caveat to that, unless we would have basically enough evidence or understanding to show that that person is at imminent risk of harm to themselves. But so that's where our hope would be, that our agency would be able to, or the area agency on aging would be able to implement services and resources earlier on before it would potentially reach to like a critical level for that person, to where they could age in place the way that they want with those services, without the idea of, now we've got somebody who is at elevated risk of self-neglect, and what do we do, kind of that scrambling to put those services into place. But yep, that's not one of our goals, to ever have somebody removed from their home.
You mentioned a minute ago that it's optimal to have people make decisions when they have choices still and the ability to make those decisions. So I'm wondering if we have an older adult, say, listening to this conference right now, and they're starting to see things slipping and wondering if, they're needing more help or whatever, where would you recommend that they start?
Mhm. When it, as it relates to like medical health and they're planning with that, having that conversation with their medical provider is a great place to start. If they do not have an established medical provider, it is a great time for them to find a clinic, a provider that they feel like they can trust and that they can discuss those things. There's areas where you can, especially with our medical providers, and a lot of our medical clinics have social workers and care managers that are working within the clinics now, that can help connect people with advanced care planning documentation, and or designating if it would possibly need to look at a power of attorney situation where they can help get them connected to those resources. It's also, I think I touched on it, but that idea of doing that search to find out where your local area agency on aging. So you can find out those resources, look at Elder Care Locator just to know what is out there. And then start to look at, and Emily used, it was that great graphic of looking at kind of that those people that you can trust. So who can you call? Like, who do you feel like you could ask? And if you have a trusted person, ask them to have that conversation of, can you help me kind of get these things in order? Can you help me understand this a little bit more? There's also elder care attorneys that are available to help with estate planning and different things. It's just that idea of, if you have somebody that you feel like you can trust, start that conversation there. And then if you are listening today and you are that person, that somebody that's an older adult trusts, know what resources are out there. You can call our Adult Protective Services intake line just to gather resources. You can call the Area Agency on Aging just to learn about what's available out there in the community that could serve that older adult. And just, again, have that conversation with compassion and have it often.
Great. And I had a question here about resources like home health supports and, websites and that sort of thing. So I'll just reiterate what you said, to reach out to your area agency on aging. For example, at the MAG Area Agency on Aging, we cover Utah, Wasatch, and Summit counties. We have a resource guide that contains information on all the home health entities out there, assisted living, skilled nursing, and so forth. So it's a good starting place for anybody looking for a resource. Does APS also have a resource page of any kind like that?
Yep. So on our website of the dos.utah.gov, it does, through our Division of Aging and Adult Services, it will help connect. So you can actually find the area agencies of aging through there. You can find and look and learn about prevention ideas that are out there, ways to help protect. It even talks about our long-term care ombudsman program. There's a lot of resources that are out there to help connect individuals. One of the other things that is a great thing to do, it doesn't necessarily, it's not an idea that would spring to mind for individuals, but to take a tour, if you're serving as a caregiver or if you are an older adult, take a tour of your local senior center. Find out what is happening there. It could be a place that you maybe occasionally visit. You could find out if there's groups, activities. I have seen some fantastic knitting classes, line dancing, bridge cut, all of those things as a way just to kind of promote that social connection. And then it's also nice just to know that there are other aging adults in your community that are wanting that social connection as well. I think one of the big things is you don't oftentimes realize that you are at risk for loneliness or in a situation of social isolation until you're in the middle of it. You oftentimes don't see those things coming. You see, well, I'm now retired and I'm slowing down a little bit, or my kids have moved away, or I'm moving out of my home into a smaller place so I don't have to maintain the lawn. And all of a sudden you realize I don't have all of my neighbors to just walk down the street with and connect with anymore. And so I think that's kind of one of those things, just knowing that there are places where you can just engage with socially. There's also a lot of, not necessarily those big, huge gyms that they have, but there's smaller gyms and communities where that can also just be a great place just to socialize and kind of learn about resources that are available as well.
Yeah, great. I'm hoping one of our moderators maybe put that DOS website in the chat. If not, yep, there it is. It just popped up. Great. So this is along the line of another question, but I think it has an interesting nuance to it. Can APS remove someone from their home if their caregiver, their spouse, is neglecting them?
So in those situations, our goal would be, if that person that's receiving care is able to communicate what they are wanting and what their hopes are, our hope would be that we can help that person, again, kind of age in that environment that they're wanting to. And for some situations, it's needing to bring additional levels of care in. And so that, especially if it comes to that concern of that caregiver being a spouse or a partner, we are oftentimes looking at that situation of, and I know that Kathy will touch on this shortly, but are we looking at concerns for caregiver burnout? So if we would bring additional resources or services or help into the home, could that help reduce that feeling of fatigue on that caregiver? And could that help promote a better relationship between the spouse as a caregiver and then somebody receiving care? It still is always that goal for us to make sure that that person is able to age in the environment that they want to, and also in the least restrictive environment, which is always going to be in the community. So we're kind of looking to see what those services and options are. But I will say that every investigation is its own investigation. So there's no adult protective services investigation that looks the same. It's all geared towards that victim in that case and wanting to make sure that their needs, desires, wants are met.
Great, okay. So this is another good one. Once a report is submitted, what happens next? Is a visit made? Is it made immediately? How far out time-wise is a follow-up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So once a report is made to our agency, if it is deemed to be a report that is accepted, then it will, and our reports are screened by multiple members within our agency. If it does rise to kind of our Utah state statute of whatever that allegation would be, if it's caretaker neglect or self-neglect or emotional abuse, then it would be assigned to a investigator in that area. And so from that time frame, our investigation team has 3 working days in order to make contact with that person that's made a report to our agency. So that's one of the plug reasons why it's so important to give your information as a referent. But within that time frame as well, there's 5 working days or 5 business days that our investigation team has to make contact with that vulnerable person. And so as much information as can be provided at the time the report is made can help facilitate that and move that process along. So is that idea of if we have the address, if we have the phone number and a way to contact that vulnerable person in the community, it helps our investigator get out there and make contact much quicker than if they're having to kind of search throughout the city or try to locate where that person is. And so after that initial interview is done with that individual, it's kind of that idea of getting a better understanding of what's happening in the situation, but then it's also looking at what does that vulnerable person want? Like, what do they want the outcome to be? And for some, it's additional services. For some, it's I recognize that it's no longer safe for me to reside here. So do we need to look at other things? For some of those situations, especially those self-neglect cases, it's helping that older adult know that there are other options in the community. So there's ways for them to age with social connection, with support, and also for a lot of them knowing that there's an option to where you could not have to maintain your lawn anymore, or you could have somebody else that could help, maybe if it would be needed to help kind of maintain those bills as you age and different things. And so there are a lot of resources and services that are available, and most of it can come just from that conversation with that investigator.
Right. Well, I know that there are a lot of misunderstandings about who Adult Protective Services is, what you do, and I think this is clearing up a lot of things because what I'm hearing is you do a lot of connecting to resources and supports to help people, which is amazing. Another question, if we know someone else, such as a family member, case manager, or somebody else has reported an incident of abuse, are we still obligated or encouraged to report it also as a mandatory reporting state, I assume?
So if you are aware that and it's one of those things where we've got that kind of idea of if you're aware of it or if you've confirmed. So if you are aware that a situation has been reported, I would still recommend that you make the report to Adult Protective Services. One of the big reasons why is every report that comes into us, even if it's for the same person, they provide a little bit different information each time. And so it could be somebody, say, I'll just use an example. If somebody was speaking to a financial institution, so they're talking to their bank over the phone and they're disclosing some things that are happening, say if the bank would report to us, they will have generally the snapshot of that conversation. So they'll know that one brief thing that happened enough to make a report to our agency. But if there's a family member or somebody that's also aware of that, it can be really helpful for us to have that information as well, just because they may have more in terms of the interaction between that alleged victim and that alleged perpetrator, or if they are able to speak more to the situation or the cognitive decline for that vulnerable adult. So that's always really helpful. They also can be listed just as a collateral. And so if you would have somebody, so Linda, I'll use you and I as an example. If I would make a report for a vulnerable adult in the population and say that you are a family member that lives down the street, I would hopefully list you as a collateral too, because I know that you have information as it relates to kind of what's happening and what's going on in that situation. And so you have the option to be that person that's reporting, or you also have the option to list somebody as a collateral so that we're hopefully catching all of that information through that report that's coming into us. But I will say we will sometimes have multiple reports that will come in from the same individual from different people within the community. And all of them give us a little bit more information each time we get another report.
A different view of the situation. So I'm going to do one more question and then we'll take a break after that. So you've mentioned already that people have the right to make choices for themselves. So somebody asks, how do you know when choosing to live a certain way crosses the line to self-neglect? And what steps would APS take in those instances when it has crossed that line?
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at it as a case-by-case basis. Even if we would have multiple cases that would come in over a period of time for one individual, we are kind of with that goal of having it be a fair and ethical investigation. We are looking at past involvement, but we're also taking that one investigation in at a time. And then it's looking at, do they have, when our investigators determine that person's capacity to consent, which would lead to the right to self-determination, we're looking at a number of factors. Do they understand kind of the situation that they're in? Do they understand what the concerns are that other people are making in the community? What do they know and see as their options and choices to make a difference? Do they know that they have access to the area agency on aging, or do they know that their family is willing to provide care, but they're just not willing to allow that to happen? And one of the big ones that we look at is, do they understand the nature and the consequences of remaining in that situation? Do they know kind of what could be that long-term impact of either remaining in a situation where they could be neglecting themselves, or even in a situation where, say, they have a caregiver or concern for kind of emotional abuse that's happening? And then that's also one of the big pieces is, do they know, even if they know the choices, do they know how to implement those decisions? Do they know who they would need to call? One of the big things that we look at is, as it relates to self-neglect, does that person know how to access emergency services if there would be a need? Do they know kind of those steps? For some, it's fear or concern for accessing those services, because again, that fear comes, if I go to the hospital, will I be able to come back home again? And so it's looking at that idea of, do they know just what's out there, but also do they know what services? It could be through education from adult protective services, from family members, through research, to know that there's things that could be put into place prior to that crisis level happening that could help them age in place a little bit longer. But to the next point of that, if we do have situations where there would be concerns of that person not being able to kind of make those informed choices or decisions for themselves, or they've not been able to demonstrate that they can keep themselves safe in the community, we do have a number of agency partners that we do work with to help if we need to put an informed decision maker into place, or if we need to help that person just have a little bit extra support. And then it may be, we're also looking for family members, community members that are willing to kind of step in and take that community approach, so that we can help older adults age in place, but still in that least restrictive way possible.
Megan, you've been a trooper. You went through a ton of questions and answered them very thoroughly for us. So thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation.
Yes, thanks for having me.